the sound of the heavy oak table vibrating under the force of a violent slam. That's what I remember most vividly. Mr. Vane, my father's attorney, a slick, high-priced shark who charged more per hour than most soldiers made in a month, was practically foaming at the mouth. He pointed a manicured finger right at my face, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls like a gunshot. "Dishonorable discharge, drug abuse, insubordination," he shouted, letting the accusations hang in the stale air like smoke. To the rest of the courtroom, I must have looked petrified. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, staring straight ahead without flinching. They saw a disgraced former soldier being exposed for her failures. But inside I was calculating the blast radius of what was about to happen. The room fell into that heavy, suffocating silence you only get right before a verdict. Everyone turned to the bench, expecting a gavel bang or a harsh admonishment for the outburst. But the Honorable William Sterling, a judge known for his rigid adherence to procedure, did something impossible. He didn't speak. He didn't bang his gavel. He just stared at the document Vane had thrown down, and then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he reached for the collar of his judicial robe. He began to unbutton it. The bailiff's hand drifted toward his sidearm, confusion rippling through the room. Why was a superior court judge disrobing in the middle of a session? To understand why a judge would risk his career to break protocol like that, you have to understand the lie that brought us there. It started 3 months ago, in a room that smelled of old money and leather polish. We were gathered for the reading of my grandfather's will. He was a World War II legend, a man who cast a shadow so long my father had spent his entire life trying to crawl out from under it. The estate was massive, but there was a catch, a legacy clause. It was simple and brutal. No beneficiary who had brought public shame or dishonor to the Vance name could inherit a single dime. That was the moment my father, Colonel Rhett Richard Vance, a man who loved his rank more than he ever loved his children, made his move. He didn't look sad about his own father's death. He looked eager. With a theatrical sigh, he pulled a file from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "I didn't want to do this, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But we have to protect the brand." It was my discharge papers. Or rather, the papers the world was allowed to see. They listed my separation from the army after only 18 months. The reason? Conduct unbecoming. In the civilian world, that's code for a screw-up. In my father's world, it was a death sentence. He pointed to the paper, tapping the line that mentioned substance abuse protocols. He looked at me with that familiar mix of disappointment and disgust, the same look he gave me when I didn't make varsity track, the same look when I didn't get into West Point. "A junkie," he sneered, finally dropping the act. "You washed out of basic logistics because you couldn't stay clean. You're a liability, Elena." I didn't argue. How could I? I couldn't tell him that the rehab was actually recovery time from a botched extraction in a hostile nation. I couldn't tell him that I didn't wash out. I was recruited. I was pulled into a Tier 1 clandestine unit, where dishonorable discharge is just part of the uniform, a cover story to make sure no one asks where you go at night. He saw a failure. I saw the price of admission for saving lives he wouldn't even believe existed. He sat back, smug and victorious, thinking he had just cut the cancer out of the family trust. My father thought he was presenting a smoking gun. He didn't realize he was waving a classified red flag in front of the only other person in the room with the clearance to read it. My life was a split-screen nightmare, a constant, exhausting oscillation between two violently different realities. At home, I was the cautionary tale, the screw-up who couldn't cut it in the real army. I'd sit at Sunday dinner, picking at my roast beef, while my father beamed at my brother, Mark, a mediocre captain in logistics who treated his supply chain command like he was leading the invasion of Normandy. Mark was the heir apparent, the one who kept his creases sharp and his service record boringly public. To my father, Mark was a soldier. To me, he was a guy who managed Excel spreadsheets for blanket requisitions. But I couldn't say that. I had to sit there and swallow the criticism while they toasted Mark's bravery for surviving a desk audit. My cover story was dull by design, a private logistics consultant working for nameless corporate clients. It was supposed to sound boring so no one would ask follow-up questions. but my father took it as a personal insult to his legacy. Glorified trucking dispatch, he'd call it, swirling his scotch with a look of profound pity. He'd lecture me on ambition, telling me that if I just had a little more grit, I wouldn't be wasting my life coordinating shipping containers. It was almost funny. If it didn't hurt so much. He was lecturing me on grit while I was secretly operating under Title 50 authority, managing assets that didn't officially exist. He saw a dropout, the Pentagon saw a ghost. The truth was, I hadn't washed out. I had been sheep-dipped. That's the term for when they strip your military identity, fake a discharge, and move you into the deep black of the intelligence support activity, the activity. My separation wasn't a failure. It was a prerequisite for handling compartmented information that would make my father's security clearance look like a library card. There were nights I'd be at the family dining table, nodding along to a lecture about discipline, while my hand was under the table, texting a kill code for a drone strike in the Horn of Africa. I was balancing life and death decisions on a burner phone, while being told I didn't know the value of hard work. Then there was the drug rumor, the one Vaughn had just shouted in court. My family whispered about my stint in rehab like it was a dirty little secret, a moral failing I couldn't shake. I remembered that rehab. I remembered the screaming pain of shattered vertebrae after a high-altitude, low-opening jump went sideways over a hostile border. I didn't land in a clinic because I was chasing a high. I landed there because I hit the ground at terminal velocity trying to secure a target. That shame they whispered about was actually a Purple Heart I could never wear. A medal locked in a safe deposit box in Virginia. Every time my mother gave me that sad, knowing look, asking if I was staying clean, I felt the weight of that silence, another scar earned for a family that saw only the bandage, never the wound. I tried to stop this before it got to a courtroom. I really did. A week before the hearing, I went to my father's study, a room lined with his awards and a conspicuously empty space where my photo should have been. I stood before his desk, feeling like a teenager again, and tried to offer him an out. "The paperwork doesn't tell the whole story, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, trying to bridge the gap without breaking my non-disclosure agreement. "Please, just drop this. You don't want to pull this thread." I was offering him mercy, a chance to save face before he walked into a minefield he couldn't see. He just laughed, a harsh, barking sound that made my stomach turn. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking at me with absolute certainty, interpreting my discretion as guilt. "The paper says everything, Elena," he said, tapping the desk with a finger that had never pulled a trigger in anger. "You failed. You're a liability to this family, and I'm just doing what needs to be done to protect the legacy. Accept it." He thought he was being the strong patriarch, making the hard call. He didn't realize he was talking to a woman who specialized in dismantling regimes, not just arguments. He saw a daughter begging for scraps. I saw a target painting himself with a laser designator. He mistook my silence for shame. He didn't know that in my line of work, silence is the deadliest weapon we have. And I was about to unholster it. I knew I couldn't simply take this stand and defend myself. That was the cruelest irony of the life I had chosen. The truth would set me free in this courtroom, but it would lock me up in a federal prison. If I testified about where I really was in 2019, or explained that the heroin found in my kit was actually military-grade morphine for a field trauma, I would be breaking my non-disclosure agreement. My father looked at me with that familiar, suffocating pity, thinking I was trapped by my own lies. I looked back at him and remembered every time he told me I lacked the strategic mind for command. And I decided to prove him wrong using the very bureaucracy he worshipped. I didn't file a standard defense. Instead, I spent 3 sleepless nights drafting a SIPA motion, the Classified Information Procedures Act. It's a heavy-hitter legal maneuver, a nuclear option usually reserved for espionage, trials or high-stakes terrorism cases, not petty inheritance disputes. When I slid the thick binder across the clerk's desk, the thud it made felt like the only honest sound in the building. My father's attorney, Mr. Vane, scanned the cover page and smirked, clearly confused. He saw a desperate woman throwing legal spaghetti at the wall. He didn't realize I was building a kill box. That night, I made the only phone call that mattered. I didn't call a friend to cry about the injustice of it all. I dialed a number that technically didn't exist. It connected me to Colonel Holloway, my former handler. a man who regarded emotions as inefficient variables. Status verification code 33, I said into the dark of my apartment. I didn't ask for a favor, and I didn't ask for help. I simply initiated a protocol. Code 33 is a silent alarm in the personnel database, a digital flare. That triggers a flag on a file that can only be seen by specific eyes. It was a massive risk, trusting the same cold system that had erased my identity to suddenly validate it. By the time we got to the pretrial hearing, Vane was practically giddy. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie, and mocked my motion with theatrical disdain. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he sneered, looking at the gallery for approval. "She's trying to bury her drug charges under fake national security nonsense to delay the inevitable." He called it a fantasy, a desperate stall tactic from a washout who watched too many spy movies. I sat there and took it, letting his insults pile up on my internal ledger next to years of my father's dismissal. They pushed hard for immediate summary judgment in open court, thinking they were cornering a liar. I let them do it. In fact, I was counting on it. I had done my reconnaissance on the man sitting on the bench. Judge Sterling wasn't just a local magistrate. He was a former JAG officer with a history in special operations law. My family saw a judge. I saw a man who knew how to read between the redacted lines. Vane thought he was exposing a fraud, but he was blindly marching his client into a restricted zone. They wanted a public spectacle? Fine. I filed the motion, sat back, and waited for the system to blink. Mr. Vane finally stopped talking, leaving a heavy, smug silence in his wake like a toxic cloud. He had painted a complete portrait of me as a disgrace, a drug addict who washed out of basic training and dragged the Vance family name through the mud. My father refused to even look at me, his face set in that stony mask of disappointment I knew so well from my childhood. I looked at his rigid profile and thought about the years of missed birthdays, the cold shoulders, and the way he introduced my brother as the soldier and me as just the civilian. He thought this moment was his final vindication, the ultimate proof that he was right to cast me aside to protect his precious legacy. But Judge Sterling wasn't looking at my father, and he certainly wasn't looking at the attorney. He was staring at the document Vane had slammed down, holding it up to the light with a deeply furrowed brow. He wasn't reading the large, bold print about misconduct or substance abuse. He was squinting. At the bottom corner, down in the administrative margins where civilians never bother to look, I saw his eyes widen, a flicker of genuine, terrifying shock that broke his judicial composure. He had found it. He had spotted the tiny bureaucratic code that acted as a skeleton key for the initiated Auth 88 redacted. The color drained from the judge's face, leaving him pale and rigid, as if he had just seen a ghost. He slowly lowered the paper and looked directly at me, his eyes searching mine for confirmation of the impossible. I didn't speak, I couldn't, but I gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The judge stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and began to unbutton his heavy judicial robe. The bailiff took a nervous step forward, hand hovering near his belt in confusion, but Sterling ignored him completely. He let the heavy black fabric fall to the chair, revealing a sharp charcoal suit underneath, but it wasn't the suit that mattered. It was the small, subtle pin on his lapel, the insignia of the activity's legal support branch. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice trembling with a suppressed rage that terrified everyone in the room. "Are you aware that the document you just slammed on my bench is a Section 8 cover separation?" He didn't wait for an answer, his gaze burning into Vane. "This isn't a discharge for misconduct, Mr. Vane. This is a manufactured biography for an operative meant to exist in the shadows. You are asking me to penalize a soldier for following orders that are classified above your pay grade." My father blinked, his arrogance faltering for the first time as he struggled to process the shift in reality. He looked from the judge to me, desperation creeping into his voice. "But, Your Honor," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the defense table. "It says drug use. It says she's a junkie. The paper says..." "That is the cover story, Colonel." The judge's shout echoed off the high ceilings, silencing my father instantly. "Your daughter didn't wash out. She was recruited into a unit that technically doesn't exist on paper. This document doesn't prove she lacks honor. It proves she has more security clearance than you, me, and the Joint Chiefs combined." The words hung in the air, dismantling my father's entire worldview in seconds. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years, and I saw the realization hit him like a physical blow. The failure he was ashamed of was actually a ghost he wasn't qualified to see. Judge Sterling turned his back on them, ignoring the court reporter who was frantically typing. He looked at me with a profound, solemn respect that I hadn't felt since I left the service. He snapped his heels together and rendered a sharp, crisp salute. The kind my father used to practice in the mirror but never gave to me. "Welcome home, Major," he said softly. "And my apologies for this, theater." My father spent 40 years chasing medals he could wear on his chest. He never understood that the most important battles are the ones you can never speak about. The silence that followed Judge Sterling's salute was heavy, but for the first time in my life it wasn't suffocating, it was liberating. He slowly lowered his hand, buttoned his robe, and returned to the bench. Transforming back from a fellow operative into an officer of the court, he looked down at Mr. Vane, who was frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase as if the documents themselves were radioactive. The judge didn't shout this time. His voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying the weight of a final judgment that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with character. He dismissed the family's petition with prejudice, a legal term that sounded to me like the slamming of a heavy iron door. He ruled that the legacy clause had indeed been violated, not by me, but by the people who tried to weaponize a hero's memory for a payout. He declared me the sole beneficiary, not because of blood, but because I was the only one in that room who understood the true spirit of the man who wrote the will. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I didn't look at my brother Mark, who was staring at his shoes, his face burning with the shame of a golden child who had just realized he was made of pyrite. I walked past the defense table, where Vane refused to make eye contact, and headed for the heavy double doors. For years I had walked out of rooms feeling small, feeling like I had to apologize for taking up space. I remembered the Christmas dinners where I was seated at the end of the table, the graduation parties where my father forgot to mention my degree, the endless, grinding feeling of being a footnote in my own family history. But as I pushed those doors open, I felt light. The ledger was closed. The afternoon sun outside the courthouse was blinding, a sharp contrast to the dim, wood-paneled tomb we had just left. I made it to the bottom of the marble steps before I heard footsteps hurrying behind me. I knew that cadence, heavy, authoritative, but now faltering slightly. It was my father. I stopped and turned, putting on my sunglasses to hide the fact that I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. He stopped a few feet away, looking older than I had ever seen him. The arrogance that had fueled him for decades was gone, replaced by a bewildered, frantic need to understand how he had misread the map so badly. "Elena?" he started, his voice cracking on my name. He reached out a hand, then dropped it, unsure if he was allowed to touch me. I didn't know. Honestly, I had no idea. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at me with pleading eyes, begging for an explanation that would absolve him, some reason why this was all a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal. He wanted me to fix it, just like I used to fix my own toys because he wouldn't help. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who had spent his life worshipping rank but ignoring the soldier. I thought about the years of silence, the secrets I kept to keep him safe, and the irony that he had tried to destroy me for it. "Because, Colonel," I said, using his rank instead of his title as a father, a demotion he felt in his bones. "You didn't have the need to know, and frankly, you didn't have the clearance." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the waiting town car, leaving him standing alone on the courthouse steps. Passers-by moved around him, unaware that the man standing there was watching his entire identity crumble. He was no longer the knowing patriarch, the keeper of the Vance legacy. He was just a man who had tried to sue a war hero for being too quiet about her service. Flash forward 1 year, and the silence in my life is different now. It's the quiet focus of a mission briefing, not the suppression of a secret. I used the inheritance to build something real. I started a private firm specializing in extraction and security for NGOs operating in non-permissive environments, places where the government can't go and where standard security won't survive. I walked into my office, the glass walls overlooking the city, and nodded to my team. They aren't blood relatives. They are former operators, intelligence analysts, and logistics experts who know exactly who I am. We don't have golden children or black sheep here. We have assets. When I sit at the head of the conference table, I don't feel the need to prove I belong. This is my family now, forged in fire, bound by competence, and sustained by loyalty. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the military cemetery where my grandfather was buried. It was a quiet day, the wind rustling through the perfectly aligned rows of white stone. I knelt in front of his marker, tracing the letters of his name. He was the only one who might have understood the choice I made, to serve in the dark so others could live in the light. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a coin. It wasn't legal tender, and it wasn't something you could buy in a gift shop. It was a heavy, matte black challenge coin, with no unit designation, just a specific geometric symbol and a Latin phrase on the rim. I pressed the coin into the dirt at the base of his headstone. No one else visiting the grave would know what it meant. My father certainly wouldn't recognize it. But my grandfather? He would have known. It was a message between soldiers, a confirmation that the legacy hadn't been broken. It had just gone underground. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked back to my car without looking back. I had a briefing at 0800. My father wanted a daughter who followed orders. Instead, he got a daughter who gave them. True honor isn't about how loud you brag. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have supported you, hit that like button and tell me your story in the comments. We read every single one.